Hello, and welcome to, well, probably not a subject you were expecting, as the story of the fourth rate has continued to fail to win the vote and patron. But it has regularly been put in, and it has regularly done quite well. And frankly, I keep doing some prep research for all the topics, because whenever I put a topic in for a video, as a patron suggestion, I have to say I'm naughty. I start the research a little bit earlier. I put the prep research in. So I spend about, well, I'd say for every question that goes up for a patron vote, I spend a good 30 minutes to an hour doing some research for it, depending on how much I get interested in the topic. So yeah, that should probably be added on as extra time spent on YouTube stuff in a week. But it's all fun stuff. It's usually roughly about 30 hours, I suppose, of work over the period before, when the questions come in and when the questions go out. And as such, this topic has come up often enough that I've now spent cumulatively a significant amount of prep time on it. We're probably talking about a couple of days' work, theoretically, in normal working hours. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about it. And so, when I was considering what video I wanted to put out on the 17th, that's the premiere I do when I'm not doing a live, well, I couldn't think of anything more interesting than the fourth rates. And so here it is. The question is, when is the fourth is both not enough and too much? I adapted the question myself. Because the basic problem for the fourth rate is similar to that of the 10-inch gun. It sits there in its figures in terms of battleship guns and cruiser guns, and it looks like it's at the perfect point. You know, it's heavy enough, it's battleship grade, but it's small enough, it should be, you know, fast enough rate of fire. The trouble is, as heavy as it is, as small as it is, anything above a 9.2 inch, 9.4 inch, depending on the area, has pretty much the same rate of fire as a 12 to 14 inch gun. Pretty much the same rate of fire as you can get from a 12 to 14 inch gun. So 10 inch, under that circumstances, why? You get the same rate of fire out of a 12 inch gun, and it's going to be a far bigger hit. A far bigger hit. It's not enough force for the line, and not enough numbers for the cruising. What does that mean? Well, it means, frankly, a fourth rate would always be beaten by a third rate in a fight in a line of battle. And it was too expensive to produce in numbers to do the frigate duties. So why did they still exist? We'll get into all this in detail, but in short, they still exist because they fill a niche. It's one of those interesting things. You start talking about the small cruisers of the World War I era, the destroyer leaders and scout cruisers, and people look at you and go, that came from, that was a really innovative idea they came up with, that they needed a slightly larger ship, or a slightly smaller cruiser, which could do the flagship duties for those destroyers. And someone like me will be looking at you going, that was a fourth rate. It was. You could theoretically go through the grand fleet, and you could divide it up quite consistently into first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth rates. Or the fleet at Battle of Jutland fleets. You probably put your battleships as your first rates, your battle cruisers as your second rates, your cruisers in terms of probably your armored cruisers and even your light cruisers to an extent as third rates. Then you'd put the smaller light cruisers and the scout cruisers as fourth rates. Destroyers make up your fifth rates. The German destroyers would be your sixth rates. And it basically works out. Shameless book plug. It's some great history. And it's always fun to do those sort of things as a bit of an exercise. And if you really do want some interesting times in history, go back to naval battles and start working out where the six rates fit in. It starts to give you an idea that there are certain immutable characteristics which are required for ships to do certain roles. And it's a really interesting way to look through history, because ships change, the shapes change, the systems change, the weapons they're carrying, the crew structure all changes, and yet there are some characteristics that are just required for some roles that will always be required for those roles. It's the fun. It's also the thing which can teach you a lot about what really matters when you're designing ships. And also the importance of institutional memory, because a lot of the times there have been problems with ship design and with ships produced for navies but also produced for merchant marine duties. Have been when people have come in and gone, we're going to disrupt that, we know better than history, we're not going to bother listening to any experience. They build the ship. It looks great on paper often in warships terms, for its stated wartime role. And then very quickly it's not as good in its peacetime role. A classic example of this is that the Type 22 and Type 23 frigates were far better value for money in their peacetime role than the Type 42s. 42s are destroyers. 42s have, especially the broad beam ones, the extended ones, the batch threes, have a lot of space. But they also don't have this is going to sound strange. They don't have the structuring to allow themselves to make full use of that space. They could do things, but every time they did it was difficult. Type 23 could get away with a lot because it was so compartmentalized down that you could have an entire section of the ship from basically the officer's mess out over the deck and into the hangar, which you could turn into a party space. And you could pretty much do some fun things around that. And as long as you kept people above a certain level, or below a certain level, you could have them almost wandering freely. 42 wasn't so pleasantly structured. And a 22, well, that just was designed for a cruiser role from the beginning for some reason. There is no real rhyme or reason how the 22 ends up having so many characteristics of a cruiser in it, but it's probably kind of like the Type 26. And it's interesting to note some people are pushing for a Type 26 Type 31 combo for more than just Britain. And it does make sense. But the thing is, it's basically admitting you need a two-tier cruiser force. And that is really what a fourth rate is. Because HMS Newcastle here is a good example. It's also a good example of the fact that, well, you could believe that she was still a frontline vessel 50 years after she was originally launched. And that it was the exact same vessel you were dealing with, that the wood and everything had all lasted 50 years, and, you know, she'd had her armament increased up to 54 guns, she'd been piercings up to 54, and it's all fine in about 1677, which is coincidentally when she's roughly 24 years old. So coincidentally, 24 years old, she is repaired, restored, increases piercings, but it's still the same ship. And it is the same ship. She just has a very, very big refit. And she's had refits before then. She's had lots of refits. One of the joyous points of history, I often get told by various accounts that things like the American Navy is formed to fight the Barbary pirates, you can accept, and that European powers didn't fight the Barbary pirates because it wasn't worth their while or something like that. Actually, it was occasionally, it depended on what they were doing, whether it was worth their while to fight them or not. If the British were fighting a major war against the French, hiring the Barbary pirates to not attack British ships but to go and attack French ships was just sensible business. Or strategy, depending on what your view is. However, when they weren't actually at war with the French, if the Barbary pirates were annoying, well, HMS Newcastle's first action, 1655, was when she sailed into Porto Farina in Algiers and took part in the destruction of the entire fleet of Barbary pirates based in there. Hence, that's HMS Newcastle's first battle honour. That was 1655. So yes, she had fun. She also took part in Admiral Brake's operation at Santa Cruz, and in 1665 she fought in the Battle of Lowestoft. She captured the Wapen van Rotterdam in the Battle of Roncesvalles in 1674. She took part in sort of the Glorious Revolution. She was probably the first, quite possibly the first deflection of the fleet to William, although she technically entered Plymouth under the command of her captain, George Churchill, for repairs. And when she's wrecked in the Great Storm off Spithead in 1703, she's lost with pretty much all her crew. But the point is, at this time, she is still a very, very powerful, important ship. She's a fourth rate. Fourth rates are kind of common at this point. Why? Because technology is still developing. Technology in terms of the scale and size of naval architecture, how you can build up ships, and how many of the larger ships you can build. There's also the infrastructure of bringing in the wood and all the other systems which are still developing even when she's being built. A good example is the 7 Years' War, where fourth rate vessels are pretty much the equivalent of third rates in that period. But very quickly they ceased to be, because very quickly nations managed to build bigger, they build better, they build larger. And as such, the world changes. So what are we talking about when we talk about a fourth rate? Well, it's 1625-26 period when the pay rate establishment, which is to define the pay for officers as well as crew, but mainly for officers, starts defining the tiers of ships. Why? Because captains of bigger ships get more money. So you need to work out what tier a captain is on. And the rating system, therefore, isn't about the ships. It isn't about the value of the ships or the use of the ships, really, when it first starts out. It's a pay mechanism. Very quickly does start to accord with ships doing certain roles. That's going to be a fourth rate sent to that. That's going to be a third rate. We're going to need third rates for that. It will send fifth rates for that. But yeah, starts out pay system. As most things do in time, pay tends to be a motivator. Now, by the 18th century, a fourth rate was a vessel with 46 to 60 guns mounted and pierced fore. But when it was first defined, it had to have more than 30 guns and a complement of 140 or more men. So, even between 1625 and the 1700s, there has been a movement. It used to be more than 30 guns, now it's 46 to 60 guns. It used to be 140 or more men, it's going to have more than that now. And if we consider, very shortly after this is established, this has a crew of over 250 at points in her career. There's a difference going on. Now, where do you keep finding fourth rates even after they disappear to an extent is on foreign stations. They are often on foreign stations. The North America station, that usually gets some fourth rates. The various Indian Ocean squadrons and further east tend to get fourth rates turning up because they're quite useful ships to have out in distant areas. It's also another reason they turn up. You see, in India, in Bombay, the East India Company establishes a dockyard which gets taken over by the Royal Navy. This dockyard can produce third rates, but it's very used to producing East Indiamen, made of teak. These are very, very well built ships and very solid ships, and they're very easy to convert into a fourth rate because they have 2 decks and enough spaces for enough guns to be a fourth rate, usually of roughly 56 guns. Why was this useful? Why were these on these distant stations? Well, there's an advantage to this. One, it's 2-decker, so it looks like a 2-decker from a distance, which means that it could also be a third rate. And as it's a 2-decker, it has space for an admiral, or at least a commodore, in a flagship role for the smaller stations and frigate squadrons. It's a destroyer leader. It's a scout cruiser. It's that level of duty. It's also, to an extent, a sacrificial ship. And by sacrificial, I mean this. If you need to deploy something bigger, you can. But if you don't need to, this goes around the world, is enough firepower, it looks the part enough, and it's no detraction from your battle fleet. It's no detraction from the ships of the line you need to actually fight the proper battles in Europe and the Mediterranean and occasionally in the Caribbean. You don't need these ships. If they're there, they're great. They're extra support. If they're not, no worries. And to an extent, some of the smaller third rates, the 64s like Agamemnon, fulfill a similar role. And that's another issue you have with the fourth rates, because there's always the smaller third rates, and they're arguably slightly more useful. However, there is something else to consider about this. There's the raséing system, and you have to think about that as well. When you rasé down ships, you take a first or second rate ship of the line, occasionally a third rate, but usually something bigger and tougher, and you take off decks and take it down. It still has the heavy, weighty wood of a fleet ship of the line, i.e. something that is supposed to be a third rate or a second rate or even a first rate. And so they are far thicker, far stronger timbers than you'd normally use for a frigate, or maybe even for a fourth rate when you're building it. So there again, that's another way of, how do I put this, making yourself a suitable flagship for the smaller units. HMS Leander, good example. She's kind of a special case, and I thought I'd give a few examples of the fourth rates and what they got up to. She has a bit of an interesting history. She takes part in the Battle of the Nile. She's able to exploit some of the gaps and anchor between the Pupil Sovereign and Franklin and rake both ships, which is kind of an interesting thing because she's a fourth rate, because of her size, she's able to fit in perfectly into that hole and blast away. Now, she had spent a lot of her career going around the world and had already served in the Caribbean and various other places by this point. She'd also anchored off the Dutch Gold Coast at one point. But, interesting enough, after the Battle of the Nile, she ends up with a really interesting bit of history. She is captured carrying Nelson's dispatches from the Nile. She bumps into a 74-gun third rate, the Genereux, off Clarke. She loses her captain, wounded, and Sir Edward Berry, another officer aboard, also gets injured. The French, of course, with a third rate, do manage to capture the fourth rate, and they took her into their service. And then there is the joint Russian-Ottoman besiegement of Corfu, and at that point, well, she gets returned. But interestingly enough, please note, the court-martial for Captain Thompson, her captain, and for Berry, who was aboard her at the time, it took place aboard HMS America at Sheerness. HMS America was a 64-gun third-rate ship of the line. It's a bit of interesting history. This picture, though, this does not come from any of that. This picture comes from after she's been returned, after being captured on Corfu by the Russians to the British service. And, well, she takes part in what's called the Leander Affair. In the summer of 1804, the Royal Navy had some British warships sitting off Sandy Hook, watching two French warships who had taken refuge in the American harbour. They began stopping and boarding all American ships going into New York, searching them for French goods. If anything of issue was found, the ships were detained and taken to Halifax. They did this outside the American territorial limit, and America found it incredibly annoying, but there wasn't really much they could do about it at the time. This is one of the things which does contribute later on to the War of 1812. But on the British side of things, You have 2 French ships taking residence in your harbour, and you haven't done anything about it. That doesn't really sound like neutral behaviour. You're literally allowing the enemy to hide in you. That's the British perception. The American perception is we've basically marooned these ships. They're not going anywhere. Why are you upset about it? On both sides, there is a lot of willful not wanting to understand what the other one might be worried about. Anyway, by 1806, this is getting far too routine. And on the 25th of April 1806, Leander fires a warning shot over the bow of a merchant vessel. Trouble is, the cannonball went a lot further than it was supposed to, because it was so routine, no one was really checking. They were so used to doing it. Sadly enough, this ball did not just hit a house, or hit one of the French ships, or anything that would have probably caused a lot less trouble, because if it hit a house, honestly, with the pace it was probably going, it probably wouldn't have done much damage to the house, and would probably have been able, someone would have probably paid quietly to fix it. One of the ship's officers would have paid quietly to sort it out. That sort of thing has happened in other ports over the years, and that's usually a richer lieutenant has gone ashore and dropped off money and sorted things out appropriately. That's how it's been dealt with. Unfortunately, it decapitated John Pierce, the helmsman of the Richard, a coasting sloop, which was inside the harbour. Pierce's brother, who was also the sloop's captain, then made his way to New York City, where he paraded Pierce's body and head through the streets demanding vengeance. I don't have a brother, but I have a sister, and if someone did do that to her, I would probably do much the same. Surprisingly, next day, an angry mob intercepted a party from Leander returning to their ship with a load of provisions. Yes, the British were, not only were they blockading, let's put it this way, in all but name, the American ports to watch for French contraband, they were also running their ships into those aforementioned harbours to buy goods to blockade them with. They were provisioning their ships from literally the same harbours they were officially blockading. So again, before anyone gets too annoyed with the British blockading the Americans on this front, the Americans were also happy for the British ships to come in and were selling them food so they could carry out the operation. There is a level of realpolitik going on here which is beyond satire. Truly, truly it is. There's also a case of when people get upset and go, the British were blockading the Americans here. They were. Do you know where the British ships were getting the food from so they could carry out the blockading operations? Where? They're buying it in American ports they're blockading. It's always fun. Anyway. And before you think this is a small amount of provisions they're buying, the mob intercepts the party with the provisions. They seize the provisions, place them on 20 carts. So 20 cart loads of provisions. And they wheel it round the city with the lead one bearing an American flag flying over a British flag on a pole. And then they distributed the provisions at the almshouse to the poor and burnt the British flag. John Pierce is given a public funeral. They have a protest meetings on the instance. 4 of Leander's officers caught ashore were imprisoned for their own protection by the authorities and later secretly released, is the phrase that's often used. Basically, the Americans made sure they got to a boat and were back to their ship quickly and quietly. It was only on the 14th of June 14th of June. Remember, that had all happened on the 25th and 26th of April. When Thomas Jefferson really, really needs something to start shouting about, that he issues a proclamation against the captain of HMS Leander. He ordered her and the other 2 ships to immediately quit US waters and forbade them ever to return, and included their captains in this. It is a lovely proclamation. This is a lovely proclamation for him to make, because it really does allow Jefferson to go, "Hey, look at me. I'm making big statements." The reality is not much happens. Whitby, the captain of Leander, when he returns to the UK, is court-martialed on the charge of murdering John Pierce, but is acquitted because it's basically considered, well, if you fire a cannon, sometimes sugar happens. But the whole thing was handled kind of badly. But it was also kind of bad luck for everyone involved. The British ships stay out there. And in fact, I'm fairly certain Leander still gets her provisions from pretty much the same harbour a few months later. She doesn't actually return to the UK till 1807, so yeah. History is fun. Then we have Indefatigable. Now, she is a Razzie. She starts out as one of the Ardent class 64-gun third-rate ships of the line. And she is converted into a 44-gun Razzie frigate. And she is, well, how do I put this? She's converted in 1794. She'd been launched originally in 1784 as a third rate. Basically, the Royal Navy decided halfway through building that, frankly, the French were only building 74s. 64 might not be enough. So they were looking for other uses of the ship, and they decided to go, well, we do need some more fourth rates. Now, there is, how do I put this politely, a rather large list of ships for which she gained full or partial credit for the capture and seizure of, when she was leading squadrons of frigates to, for want of a better phrase, hoover up enemy trade and abilities. For example, in 1795, on the 9th of March alone, she was involved in the capture of the Temeraire, Minerva, Gentile, Regeneration, and a brig and a sloop, names of which were not recorded. Always nice when you capture 6 ships in one day. Between the 11th and 21st of March, she did like to be active. The Favourite Sultana, the Friends, the Providence, the Four Marys, the Amiable Justine, and the Naval Union were all captured, along with some Chasse Maries and various other unnamed vessels. Totaling in her career is quite disturbing. Within the region of 100 vessels being captured or by her in a group of other ships during her, well, I would like to say, sections of her career from 1795 to about 1812. And that's the ones we have fairly decent records for. Sometimes she seems to have taken part in capturing en masse, en bulk. She was a very effective vessel for doing these things. Why? Because Razang could make a very good fourth rate with beautiful lines, very heavy guns for her size. Because remember, she's basically able to take the lower deck of ship-of-the-line third-rate guns. That does help. And she's very capable of that. She is carrying 26 24-pounder guns. 8 12-pounders and 4 42-pounder carronades on the quarterdeck, and 4 12-pounder guns and long guns and 2 42-pounder carronades on the forecastle. So she's carrying 12 12-pounders, 6 42-pounder carronades, and 26 24-pounder guns. She's most famous because, honestly, she's lucky. She gets Edward Pellew as her captain. He commands her from 1794 till 1799. And it's those 5 years when he's leading vessels such as Concord and Jason in his free squadrons, his independent squadrons, that she's really successful. And once she has that as a reputation, once she has that capability, she's considered very useful and very good. Now, those of you who've been doing maths will probably be going, hang on, Alex, she doesn't have enough guns to be a 4th rate, so why are you including her in the discussion of 4th rates? Well, technically, she would be a heavy 5th rate. Technically, she would be a heavy 5th rate, but this is one of the problems you have for 4th rates. If a 5th rate has that much power and that much capability, technically a 5th rate, she's a Raz-A, but she's technically a 5th rate because of the number of guns, that's stepping up. And again, the 3rd rates are being produced in such large numbers. The 4th rate has this continual problem. It's not enough firepower to do what the 3rd rate's required to do. It's not cheap enough to be produced in the numbers of the 5th rates. If you look, very quickly, the largest numbers, 103, 134, 360. Sloops of war, the smaller vessels, unrated, all those things. There are roughly 360 of them. In commission 1814. Massively large number of these ships. And that fits with what the Royal Navy needs them for, but it also fits with what most navies need them for. If you're going to look for a large number of 4th rates, you're talking about a fleet which probably can't build enough 3rd rates. Or, why would, if they build a 4th rate, to do a 5th rate's job? Because you're building something more than you need. Okay, maybe you could be a fleet going, right, and what we're going to do instead was we're going to build a whole load of 4th rates to cover for the 5th rates and 3rd rates instead. We're going to save money that way. Well, you're never going to have enough vessels to do both, because you're going to need roughly 200 vessels to do both roles. So that's going to be a lot of ships to build. They're going to be far more expensive and not really as capable as the vessels you can build for the 5th rate role. And whereas a 3rd rate can, to an extent, hold its own against a 2nd rate and a 1st rate. Not for long, and not usually advisable, but they can hold their own, and if there's a pack of them, they can certainly win. 4th rates don't have that level of firepower. Especially once you're talking about 74s, etc. The 4th rate just sits there in the middle. It's this theoretically great pinch point, but actually it's just not enough of one or the other to do these roles. And we're talking about the Royal Navy here. It's always a good navy to look into, because in the age of sail, we're talking about almost a virtually unlimited budget. If the Royal Navy really wanted something, they could build it. If they really wanted to build 24 extra 4th rates to have in service, they could have had them. At some points, they have a lot of them in service in terms of ships with those numbers of guns, because that is the vessel that's available for that time. 7 Years' War is a good example. But later on, no. They can build enough third rates, they're not going to need them for the fighting line. They can build enough fifth rates, they don't need them for the cruising missions. What do they need some of them for? Well, sometimes they back things up, but more often not, they're station flagships. If you look at that number and you go, well, they have roughly 10 for roughly 134. If we were going, that could be roughly, what? 10 independent squadrons, each of 5 frigates and 10 of those, so 60 vessels are going off. And then that leaves you with 74 extra fifth rates to do other things. The other interesting thing here is the sixth rate, which has also disappeared. The post ships, the smaller ships, they are still around. There's a couple of them going around. And sloops of war. There's a lot of those going around. There are also gun brigs, cutters, schooners, 4 to 14 gun vessels, lots of those going around. But finding them, that's always fun. Now, I will admit that I haven't quite polished the table up as much as I probably should have done. I found it in an old slide, and I should probably have played around with it a bit more, but it illustrates the point. The fourth rate sits there, snugly between the third rates and the fifth rates. And there are barely any more of them than there are first rates. In fact, in 1794, there are more second rates in commission than fourth rates. More second rates in commission. Because they're just not what you need for most of the duties. The duties you do need them for, you build them for, but you don't need a large group of them for that. Ah, HMS Leopard. Another one which likes to get into trouble with the Americans. She takes part in the French Revolutionary Wars, Napoleonic Wars. She does all sorts of fun things in her career, but the Chesapeake Leopard affair is usually what we talk about with her, because in 1807, some British sailors, some of whom were of American birth, deserted their ships. Now, these people had been sailing on British ships and drawing the pay of the Crown, so the Royal Navy tends to get very fussy about that and deserting their ships. They were still taking part in the blockade of French ships in Chesapeake Bay. And some of these British sailors joined the USS Chesapeake. Now, at this point, the British flagship is sent by the Commander-in-Chief of the station. And this is Leopard is his station flagship, to hail the Chesapeake and to request permission to search her to get their wayward crew from her. For some reason, the Commodore, James Barron of the Chesapeake, refused this. I can understand why. You're another nation's warship. You do not get searched. But the British are also getting annoyed with their sailors disappearing off. Now, you could say there could be some diplomatic methods of dealing with this, but really, you can't. And at this point, you have got the fact that the British are, to an extent, becoming over-familiar with the Americans. And why do I always say that? Because they have been now wandering off their coast for so long, keeping track of French ships calling into their ports, that, and the fact that they speak the same language and all these sort of things mean that, to an extent, the British just expect them to help them, or at least cooperate with them when they're doing this, and they don't understand when they're not. And when they're not, it's treated with, oh, that's an affront to the crown scenario. And that's where you get a problem, because what happens is Baron refuses, and HMS Leopard opens fire. Now, the USS Chesapeake is a good ship. Chesapeake is a good ship. She's armed with 18-pounders. She's a capable vessel in her own right. However, HMS Leopard has 22 24-pounder guns, 22 12-pounder guns, and about 8 6-pounder guns. It's not really a fair fight, and it's basically a blast and charge in that they fire some salvos and then they board and seize. Baron surrenders. Humphrey gets the search, and they seize 4 deserters from the Royal Navy. 3 of them whom were Americans and 1 British-born. They took them to Halifax. Jenkin Radford, the British-born sailor, was hanged for desertion. The American-born sailors had their initial sentence of 500 lashes commuted, and Britain returned them to America. This nearly led to the 2 nations going to war. But the problem was, once again, there were actually more sailors aboard that were of British origins, but they hadn't served in the Royal Navy. It's one of the really, really weird things if you think about when they fired, all this stuff has happened, and the Americans have had 4 killed and 17 wounded. But the British are very precise about who they take off the ship. Unsurprisingly, the incident caused outrage, but unsurprisingly again, this is a 4th rate involved in this. Why? Because they're the muscle of these distant stations, and the trouble is they don't have enough muscle to be overwhelming. One has to ask, how would the American captain have necessarily dealt with it in terms of a 3rd rate or a larger ship turning up? He might, I don't think he would have still agreed to a search, but he might have asked them for a list of names to check his crew. Because you could frame it as, if they've deserted from you, they'll desert from me. Do I have any faith in their word as their bond? Or at least maybe hand over the British-born gentleman. But no. He was comfortable with a 4th rate, with arguing with back with it and going, yeah, but 24-pounders. They're good cannon 24-pounders. And when you have enough of them, you can do a lot of damage. And so it has enough firepower to do the job, but not enough firepower to overraw for the job. Now, I thought it would be good to not just talk about British 4th rates in this, and I wanted to talk about some of the Dutch ones as well. This is a Delft. She was a 56-gun vessel. She was launched in 1783. She took part in the Battle of Camperdown. She was, well, she surrendered to the British, but actually sank off Schengen 4 days later. Interesting enough, the British also captured the Hercules, which they renamed Delft after they've captured and renamed that ship Hercules as HMS Delft, because how brave a fight Delft had put up in the battle in Camperdown. She'd had an interesting career. Once again, we're talking distant stations, because she, in 1787, took part in a mission against the Barbary pirates. In 1793, she took part in an operation which freed 75 Dutch slaves from Algiers. And when the French in 1795 had originally, well, acquired the Dutch Republic is how I would put it, they disarmed the Delft because they feared that the Orangist rebels would use her. There again, they disarmed a lot of things because they feared various people would use her. For the Dutch, four freights were far more part of their fleet. Why? Well, A, they have shallower waters to deal with. B, they have more crew limitations. But C, they do quite a lot of long-range patrolling for the Dutch. And they want to turn up with enough firepower, guaranteed wherever they do, to defend the Dutch East Indies, etc. against whoever might be their problem. Quite often it was the Spanish, occasionally it was the English. Sometimes it was even the French. You know, they all like to go around and cause trouble. So, four freights were slightly more common for the size of the Navy in the Dutch Navy. But still not massively common, because again, you have the same problem. You're basically building a ship, a very big ship, to do a fifth rate role, but it's not big enough to fill in the third rate role. And at Camperdown, they fight well. At Camperdown, the Dutch have four: the Beschermer, the Batavia, and the Delft, of course, and the Alkmaar. The Hercules is actually a third rate, which the British rename after the fourth rate. In contrast, the Royal Navy has two: Adamant and Isis. The Royal Navy has two fourth rates there, and you can honestly argue they have them there because they're making up the numbers of their fleets, because they've got so many third rates out around the world. These are 2 ships out of 16 ships of the line they have there. The Dutch fourth rates are 4 out of 15. For the Dutch fleet, that's almost 1/3 of their strength. For the British, that's 1/8 of their strength there. But the Dutch was a cruising navy which was more spread out around the world for its size than any other navy, and that is why they have them. So, I hope you've enjoyed, because I think this is the last slide of this video, I hope you've enjoyed the discussion of the fourth rates. I know this is not as long as I normally do a live on a Thursday evening, but I thought you might enjoy something slightly different for the premiere this evening. Fourth rates are interesting ships. They are good ships. But they are neither fish nor fowl. They are not enough firepower for the battle line to justify them being procured for that. And they are not cheap enough and easy enough to crew and provision to justify them for the cruising role. They provide a role which is leading the cruising role. And that is a far smaller role to justify. Especially when you're having to compete against often quite a few of the 64s. Because whilst the British stop building 64s to concentrate on 74s to match the French when they start focusing on it, the British still have plenty of 64s around. And if we consider HMS Africa at the Battle of Trafalgar, they turn up in places and they do a very interesting role. And in many ways they're just as capable of being independent cruiser leaders as a fourth rate is. And then you have to ask yourself, which is better for my operations? A fourth rate or a small third rate? Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. And yeah, I normally add in questions at this point, and I probably will do, but I think the question I would have for you all today would be, which of the Age Sail battles yet to be covered on this channel would you really like to be covered, and why? because I'm thinking about some special videos for the Christmas period. And yeah, I'd love to hear your suggestions of what you might like to see covered. Thank you very much for watching, and take care.